Good morning, everyone. We're here at last. It's been a long time coming. I don't think I've ever been preparing for a talk longer than this one. And that's just not the last 2 years I've been preparing, it's the last 40 years. Let me start, though, by building on our welcome to country and acknowledge the Jagera, Giabal and Jarawia peoples who are the traditional owners on the land in which this amazing theatre is built. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, those of you who are old enough to take your minds back to 1973, that's where I'd like to start. And those of you who don't remember 1973 for whatever reason, and there's a few I can think of. The younger ones, of course, are excused, but the older ones who don't remember it, well, we won't go there. But I'll tell you a little bit of a story around the 70s and try and bring you through to the current day. So 1973, Gough Whitlam was the Australian Prime Minister. Here in Queensland, it was a darker time with Joh Bjelke-Petersen years as Premier. The Queen, now the late Queen, opened the Sydney Opera House. And all the students of popular Australian culture will of course know that AC/DC performed for the first time in Sydney. And it was also the year that I entered first year agricultural science at the University of Queensland. That was just a blip on the agronomic radar, but the thing that was more significant in agronomy in 1973 was that Colin M. Donald retired as the Waite Professor of Agriculture and head of the Department of Agronomy at the University of Adelaide. So a few months short of 50 years later, it is 50 years, I stand here honoured to be receiving the Donald Medal for agronomy. There are 18, I think, others who have received this citation in the history of the award. I know some of them are here today. I met at least 2 last night. There might be more that I haven't met yet. Now, many of my agronomy heroes from my career, from days past, are in that list of 18, and I find it somewhat daunting to be in their company and present an oration that's up to what they've done before. So, this narrative is an unashamedly personal recollection of the state of agronomy in the early 70s, and it seeks to track that evolution to the present day. The focus is largely Australian, but at times international comparisons are called upon. And so the talk's structured around these 3 areas. My own journey, stepping back and looking at the wider agronomic journey, and then reflections. So my own journey starts here in the 1970s at the University of Queensland. Undergraduate days, some of my graduating class there. There's at least one Director General of Agriculture in that photo. Outside the Hartley Teakle building, which many will know at St. Lucia. I'm standing in the middle with the short shorts and long hair. So hair and dress fashions have changed, fortunately, but that's where I started. I got interested in agriculture. I was a city boy, but I got interested in agriculture because of my interest in plants, and plant diversity fascinated me. And you would have thought I got into plant breeding, and that's probably what first attracted me to agriculture, the idea of plant breeding and the variation that comes from that. But serendipity struck in '76, and an opportunity arose for a postgrad project in agronomy. That was with the tropical root crop cassava. And I embarked on a PhD, an extravaganza of white peg trials for the next 4 years. And I quickly came to recognise that environment and management could have at least as big an effect on plant growth and development as did genetics. So, lots of trials, lots of planting date studies, growth curves in a subtropical environment. lots of indicators of how environment shape plant growth and development. But reflecting back now on Australian agronomy in the 1970s, my contention, as I see it now, is that it was not seen as the cutting edge of agricultural science. It wasn't seen necessarily as a prestige career course. There was a number of terms that often raised implied agronomy was more of an empirical art than a scientific endeavour. Notions such as rates and dates, spray and pray are a couple of examples. Unlike the US, where the American Society of Agronomy dates back to 1907, Australia had no agronomy society in the 70s and tended to focus on more specialised professional societies, plant physiology, soil science, animal science and so on. And it wasn't until 1980 that we saw the first Australian Society of Agronomy meeting at Gatton, just down the hill from here. And I attended that meeting as a postgrad student. But I think I graduated from 4 years of agricultural science without ever hearing about crop and soil simulation modelling. I heard nothing about C.T. DeWitt, even though he had led the way in modelling a decade earlier. I did actually hear about C.M. Donnell's idiotype, and I did hear about Henry Nix's agroclimate analysis in Australian cropping, and I'll return to both of those gentlemen later. So agronomy's core methods in the 70s, from my recollection, others will no doubt debate this and we'll have talks after at some point, but we were taught you posed a question, you selected some treatments, you recorded your observations, and you went straight to your statistician to do an analysis of variance to see if any of those treatments were significantly different. That was the beginning and end of it. Now, those experimental results were highly conditional on site and seasonal factors, and we were really limited in our capacity to understand what was going on in those experiments. The idea of a probabilistic base to interventions in dryland agriculture was almost nowhere to be seen, and there were no methods available to agronomists to deal with the riskiness of farm management at the time. Just think about it, it was another 10 years before French and Schultz would provide us with a simple quantitative foundation to explore water use and crop yield. That wasn't until 84, so I'm talking here 74, 73. There were some agricultural economists, most notably from the University of New England, who were starting to develop some theory and methods to explore agricultural decision-making under risk. And I'll recognise here Jock Anderson, Hardacre, John Dillon. But it was actually some time before agronomists took any notice of that work. So I put the notion of white pegs in the title of this talk, and in my research, up until last night actually, the earliest origins I could find for that term was a paper from Henry Nix in 1980. And Henry wrote, the prevailing conventional white peg agronomy is deeply entrenched component of crop research. Statistical differentiation of treatment effects in situations where site and season interactions may account for a major share of the total variance is not conducive to understanding nor to the development of general functional relationships. Now, 2 points arise from that. Henry passed away earlier this year, and I'd like to acknowledge his passing. He was one of the first people from CSIRO I ever met. I went looking for a job with him, or his support in getting a CSIRO postdoc in about 1979. So the part Henry played in the story of Australian agronomy is significant, and I hope that becomes clear before I finish this talk. Now, last night I was talking to John Angus, and it just shows you never stop learning. And John pointed out to me this paper, which he sent me overnight, and it's a great paper. I've never seen it before. So Angus, Basinski and Nix, 1974, and it does use the term white peg agronomy. So, John, all credit to you for that. And I'm not saying it is the first, but it could well be. But I know Henry Nix is an author on both, so let's acknowledge Henry as well. So, going beyond white pigs in my PhD program, so my cassava trials were driven by a desire to determine where cassava might be adapted in Australia. And we had all this growth rate data for different environmental conditions. And we tried to build ourselves some models of, well, how could we predict what sort of rates of growth we might get in relation to things like radiation and temperature and so on. But these were effectively statistical models, and there's all sorts of confounding factors at play, as you can imagine. So this was 79 by this stage, so there were mechanistic simulation models starting to appear. I think Peter Carberry started his PhD in about 82, Peter. And it was fully on simulation models. In 79, I was writing up my PhD and hadn't discovered them, basically. But once again, another learning. In preparing this talk, I went back through earlier Donald orations. And one of my supervisors was Professor Graham Wilson. And Graham gave the Donald oration in 1992. And this is a quote that I read for the first time last year. So Graham said, "I am profoundly ignorant on the subject of simulation modelling, which has come to occupy a dominant position in crop physiology." So that's why I never discovered simulation models. But two pioneers in simulation modelling, Bob Loomis from California and David Connor, ended up as my PhD examiners. So you can imagine this was potentially a pretty bad thing. But they were really kind to me, and they didn't fail me for my limited analytical toolkit in 1980, but they did point out where I could have gone with that work. And subsequently that data was eventually used to build cassava models and so on. So, we're into the early 80s now. I was looking for a job. I wanted to go to work with Monteith's group in their controlled environment facilities. I think they were in Sutton Bonington, is that right? People remember that? That's what I remember anyway. I think it might have been Chinong working with Monteith. I applied for a CSIRO postdoc to go there. Henry Nix was my sponsor. Didn't get that. I was about to go to Mexico as a postdoc with CIMMIT. And it was only some months before that was likely to happen, and I got a phone call from Ted Hensel, featured on this slide. Ted was chief of the CSIRO Tropical Crops and Pastures. He said a vacancy had arisen through the untimely death of Colin Andrew. Colin might be known to some. He was a fairly well-known plant nutritionist. And would I come around to have a chat about it? So jobs in CSIRO in those days were really few and far between. And so that was the first of, so I quickly went round and had a chat, and the rest is history, as they say. First of many chats I had in CSIRO over the next 36 years. I don't think I ever proactively applied for a job in CSIRO, even that first one. Things just emerged, and I had the opportunity to see if I could do it. So my early time in CSIRO was not particularly well focused. Fuzzy ideas about legume adaptation on heavy clay soils. To the west of here, Dalby, we did a lot of work at Dalby. I'm not sure we solved a lot of problems, but I sure learnt a lot, initially as a plant nutritionist, and then with a host of soil-plant relationship issues. And in those days, CSIRO Soils was co-located with CSIRO Crops and Pastures, and I used to hang out a lot with the soils people. And the soils exposure early in my career was really important to the later developments. By 1984, funding cuts in CSIRO, sounds familiar. I had to go somewhere, I couldn't stay in the job I was doing. Ted Hensel caught me in the corridor again, and we had another chat. It was amazing how informal these things were in those days. He said there was this new agency called ACIAR starting up, and they wanted to get some work going in Africa. I could stay in the division, but I couldn't stay in Brisbane. So I could go to Zaria in northern Nigeria, Machakos in eastern Kenya, or Katherine in the Northern Territory. So that was where the Australian end of the project was. I gave my wife Marianne the choice. We had 2 kids under 4 by this stage. And she chose Kenya of those 3. Turned out to be an inspired choice because it was the foundation of my career. And forever grateful that she took on that not inconsiderable challenge of taking a young family to rural Africa, rural Kenya. This turned out to be my real PhD, I believe. So I'll return to that a little bit later. By the early 90s, I was back in Australia. APSIM was starting up. APSIM was the brainchild of John Leslie from the DPI in Queensland and Bob Clements. Both the CSIRO and the state government departments were getting into decision support and modelling, and they were sparring at the boundaries. And their solution to that was just stick them together and see what happens. And certainly plenty of things happened. There was plenty of storming, forming and performing, and I say in the paper, I don't think APSIM ever normed. There was always something going on. By the late 90s, the dryland farming systems team was my major focus. I took over that role from Bob McCown, and really it was Peter and I who were co-leading this, and it was the CSIRO dimension of APSIM. Somewhat unusually for the time, we had a part of our agenda was this program or theme, I think we called them. No, in fact, they were called Key Result Areas in that day, KRAs. But it was called Improved Tools and Approaches for RD&E in Farming Systems. I'm just watching the time there, trying to work out what it means. It's counting down, thank you. That explicit attention to research tools and approaches actually is probably going to be, turned out to be our biggest legacy. So I was still active in research projects at this time. I'm going to flick through really quickly a couple of things. We were using the early models to look at drought frequencies. There was a big drought in 91 to 94 in this region. The details aren't important here. We're looking at water excess in the farming systems and leakiness in relation to how the system was configured across the Murray-Darling Basin mainly. Pretty active in nitrogen management of sugarcane, looking at balancing production issues and environmental risks, and even taking that work into the wider landscape scale, looking at contaminant loads over groundwater systems. I have to say, 2 of my early hires, Neil Huth and Kirsten Verberger, in that slide. And one of the most joyous things about having a long career in agriculture is seeing the people you hire succeed. So I'll just nominate those 2 of many. By about 2000, CSIRO tropical agriculture had melted down. And we ended up in a division called CSIRO Sustainable Ecosystems, of all things. Really weird division, you might think. And it was weird in many ways, but I was leading the agricultural landscapes program, and we were half ecologists and half agronomists. Now, you can imagine how that went. We had a lot of interesting times, but I think we're all the better for it. By the mid-2000s, I was chief of CSIRO Sustainable Ecosystems. Pretty interesting time. A new CEO in CSIRO basically trying to get rid of the chiefs, get rid of the divisions. And I ended up actually moving across to a flagship role. I'll come to that in a second. Look, all through these, going to these management roles, I'm sure most of my colleagues thought was going to the dark side. You know, you're pretty useless at different levels, and as you get higher up, you get even more useless. I have some sympathy for that view, but I did try to keep my hand in Keep Connected. This is some work I did with Peter Carberry again, just looking at framing the decisions we make about agricultural investments, research investments, and the pathways to affect change, framing that in terms of risk and return. And that did get some traction in places like GRDC. By about 2008 or so, I think, the Sustainable Agriculture Flagship had emerged. This pulled about 7 divisions of CSIRO together into one big program, focused on a whole range of productivity and environmental issues. Initially resisted by many, but I sense these days, I get a sense that it was seen as some of the best of times now. It was a really productive time, and we did make a difference, I think, in CSIRO. That still is reflected in what's going on today. So we've gone from white pigs now through to looking at the global food challenge, global food security, and framing some of the issues around resolving that by about 2014. And then completely useless by this stage as an executive responsible for CSIRO Agriculture, Food and Health, joining a new CEO. So looking back now, crazy time, but for me, a really nice bookend to my career. I told you about that phone call from Ted Hensel, which says, come over for a chat. There could be a job in CSIRO. So 36 years later, I ended up doing the same job Ted was doing, because he was one of the first that had that executive role in CSIRO. Okay. I now want to throw cast the net wider, and I'll tell my sponsors here and my managers here that I'm about 2 or 3 minutes late at this point. So I'm going to do my best, but we'll see how we go. So as I said, my journey is a small window into this wider journey. Let's talk about the wider journey. No better place to start than CM Donald in this talk. So it was Donald in '65 who first created this iconic plot of Australian wheat yields. And his own contributions for super and subclover are built into that graph. I sense this plot encouraged agronomists to look beyond their experimental white pigs to the bigger forces shaping the evolution of Australian agriculture. Donald's most significant step towards charting a new course in agronomy and his growing interest in breeding came via his considerations of the crop idiotype, a concept that came to define the later part of his career. He built this work out of his work on plant competition and plant architecture, but as far as I can determine, he never tried to translate this qualitative model put it on a quantitative basis. Now, there was another chap, a Dutchman, who was also working on competition at the same time in the early 60s, C.T. de Wit. De Wit was clearly more mathematically inclined, and his studies always involved some sort of quantitative analysis. By '68, de Wit was writing code and building one of the world's first crop simulation models in the Netherlands. And then the third axis of this triangle, third point of this triangle is the US. So Bill Duncan was a fertilizer industry engineer and returned to graduate school in the US at the age of 58 to get his PhD. And he began writing some of the first crop simulation models in the US. And he put it this way: one way of putting what we know about the parts of a system back together to see how it functions as a whole. That was what was motivating him. Now, Australia was up there too in the 60s in this sort of journey to a quantitative analysis of crop environment relationships. One of the earliest applications of computers to solve water balance came from Australia. Because we had this pioneering view of agriculture, and they were assessing agricultural potential of vast areas of the country in Northern Australia in particular. So Ralph Slatcher and his team, early reports from CSIRO's Land Use Research Land Assessment Unit. They had a model called Wattbell running on the Cyber 76 in Canberra. So Slatcher's team, Nix, Fitzpatrick, Keating, McAlpine. And I think by the early 70s, John Angus was in there as well. So Henry Nix, this is 68, early models of crop yield, linking soil water to environmental attributes and crop development. Now another key player in this story is Bob McCown. Bob was really impressed by what was coming out of Canberra in the water balance work, and he took it and started linking it to pasture growth and animal production in Northern Australia. I still recall Bob would always often tell me stories of running jobs from Townsville on the Cyber 76 in Canberra. What would happen if you got one card out of order? You'd run the thing all night, come back the next day and just get a huge printout of nothing. And you'd have to start again. Developments overseas, in the US, series, grow models, Joe Ritchie, Jimmy Jones and others. Developments, some of DeWitt's students, people like Fritz Prenning de Vries, Martin Croft, Herman Van Koolen, perhaps Rudy Rabinage. I think he might have been a DeWitt student as well. They were developing models. They were promoting a global conversation around systems analysis and modelling. And there was also stuff happening here in Australia. Lots of individual activities around particular crops. Look, I'll flag out Hammer and McKeon as a pretty relevant example here. Brian Hearn on cotton. And of course, Martin Stapper, John Angus again in the south. During the 1990s, there were links, pretty strong links between the Australian efforts, the US efforts, and the Dutch efforts. And that sort of triumvirate is really still strong today, and those three regions you think would be the strongest leaders in this area. I mentioned Bill Duncan. I'm not going to read this whole quote in the interest of time, but this is Bill Duncan in 75, and I was impressed by it. I'll just read the last part. An important use of almost any simulator is the answer to the question, what would result if? With the simulator and historical weather records, one can learn what would have resulted over past years and use the new practices or varieties, from the use of new practices or varieties. That's one of the earliest really powerful outlines of this vision for how models can inform agronomy. And those who were involved with APSIM and Toowoomba will remember the what-if analyses and discussions which came to characterise the approach in the 90s, but Bill Duncan was proposing that in 75. Henry Nix again, in 85, had a vision for systems research. This idea that resource data banks, crop system models could come together and develop management prescriptions. So that was Henry's term, management prescriptions. And this started to put a little bit more structure around the sort of emerging ideas about how models and agronomy could come together. Early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, farming systems research, FSR, was on the scene, particularly driven by international agricultural development, the CGIAR, driven by a sense that on-station research, with white pegs, I guess, was not relevant to the needs of farmers. So it was about keeping the on-station research going, but bringing more of it on-farm. pretty quickly it became clear there were problems in interpreting those farm experiments and generalising them to other soils or regions. So by 86, McCowan was back in the scene talking about how we can combine operations research, systems analysis and modelling with farming systems research. This idea that you can start inserting models into this on-station world. Now Bob, unlike Henry Nix, who talked about management prescriptions, Bob was starting to talk about action learning as the pathway by which farmer practice could be influenced. A little side journey here, one of my stories from Kenya. So I arrived in Kenya in 1985, had to come to grips with this completely new environment, smallholder subsistence farming. We did lots of white pig trials. We had an early version of Series Maize. We had the IBSNAT minimum data set manual, and we had a computer, an Olivetti M21 luggable. It had an 8086 processor and a 10 megabyte hard disk, and we loved it. It was beautiful. I think you had one of these, Peter, too. We carried them all around the world, lugged them all around the world. That's Benson Wafula, my colleague with that computer. I think, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think that might be the first personal computer used in sub-Saharan African ag research. Because up until that time, they had a mainframe up in Nairobi, a Wang or something, but no one could do anything with it. I eventually plugged that machine in to the mainframe and stripped off the climate data. And we had to repair it all because every so many bits it would give a blip and we'd get an error. Anyway, enough on that. By 1990, the Climate Risk Symposium had come to Brisbane, a real watershed of a conference to this day. I think there's never been one better to really transform the way climate risk was approached in agronomic research. And we put this figure out using some early models on steps towards sustainable intensification. It wasn't called that at the time, but we looked at how small inputs of nutrients and changing plant population and residues could start lifting output. I left Kenya in the end of '89, and the team, with John Williams' help, John Williams will be known to many here from Soils, part of CSIRO, they set up a fantastic instrumented runoff trial, and they ran for 10 years with treatments not dissimilar to what we did in that modelling hypothesis work. Ran for 10 years. That's 20 seasons in Kenya. It's a bimodal rainfall regime. About 10 years later, I was visiting, and the team there shared with me the data from those 20 seasons. And they're the average results for those seasons. And I've just put in blue there approximate translation to our initial hypothesis in 1990. What can I say? That was really satisfying. That in the 3 or 4 or 5 years that we were there, we were able to get our heads around what that system was doing, use the models to really improve our insights to its variability and risk, and come up with a hypothesis about some of the options forward. And 20 seasons later, shown to be pretty well on track. That actually went through into Southern Africa and Zimbabwe, and colleagues like John Dimes and others took it up and started promoting this idea of microdosing of small inputs of fertiliser in smallholder farming systems. I'm going to speed up. 5, yeah. 10. Oh, 10. I got plenty of time. Thanks, Peter. Look, the detail on this is not important. It's just giving you this narrative. That's what's important. So by 1990, I was back in Australia. APSIM was forming. People were gathering here in Toowoomba from different parts of the country. Peter came down from Townsville. Graham Hammer and Dave was already here, I think. Graham Hammer came up from Brisbane. And we so it had all this experience building models and adapting existing models, and it became pretty clear to us that we created a monster, trying to model a farming system with basically individual crop and soil models. So we had to start again and think about a really new platform that we could use to really deal with farm systems rather than crops. So the diagram on the left is the oldest, I think, so I'm happy to be corrected on this. I think it's the oldest surviving vision for what APSIM might become. It's come off a whiteboard in a meeting in Townsville in September 1990, and you can start to see how there are many elements there which ended up in APSIM, which is on the right as it's first published. Now, so I'm actually stopping there with telling the story. I just want to do some reflections now. I will refer you to the written paper, which I think is going online today, which unpacks a lot of this far more than I can do here today. But so I'm going to reflect on these topics. So let's start with APSIM. This graph tracks the citations for the 3 key reference papers for APSIM. There were 3. One in 96, one in 2003, and one in 2014. And you'll see them accumulating. Some of those citations double up, but many are individual. The bottom line there is APSIM's, I'll be bold and say, probably the most cited output of Australian agronomy of all time. Globally, there are 750,000 agronomy or agriculture multidisciplinary papers on the Web of Science. So APSIM, depending on how you count, the doubling up is in the top 10 of the 750,000. So it's certainly had a big impact in terms of its use. I'm not saying that's the same as impact, by the way. I'm very aware of the limitations of citations, but it's caught people's attention and been used. It's been used on lots of things. They're all the topics, if you start classifying them. By 2020, about half of those topics are agronomy or climate change adaptation or mitigation. It's been used in over 40 countries, about half in Australia and China. But what about impact, you might say? The written paper goes into this and reviews this in some length. I'm going to give one slide here because I knew I'd be short of time. One slide, which is my reflections looking back at all the impact studies and evidence. So in terms of model use in agronomic research by researchers, there's really strong evidence of transformational impact. Agronomy research is different now than it was when I started in '73. In terms of model use in government and industry policy, there's some evidence of some impact. I think it's still patchy. Government policy is a few examples. Industry policy is actually a little bit more, particularly in the investment decision making by R&D corps and so on. Model use by farmers and advisors. There's evidence of great value, but really big questions remain on sustained use. Let's unpack that last point in just with this this question. So, direct use by farmers and to develop strategies and manage operations. This was the original motivation of pioneers like Duncan and Henry Nicks. DSS development was a big driver in APSRU's formation. I think it's what our managers expected we'd be doing. The last 30 years of experience shows that models have deep value for farmers, but not routinely as a standalone decision tool, I think is my conclusion, and the conclusion of some of my colleagues. And I'll refer to Bob McCown at this point. So McCown's thesis was that the value lay as an adjunct to farmer intuition. So Bob's last 2 papers addressed this issue at some length in both theoretical and practical terms. the current hype around the Internet of Things and digital twins and all those digital agriculture sort of issues may ultimately provide us with new evidence, new insights and new opportunities for model use in farm management. But exciting as these developments are, I think the lesson I take from what I've seen is that treating farms as cybernetic systems and loss of sight of the human element of farming is likely to result in disappointment again. So, Australian agronomy in 2022. So my contention at the outset of the talk was agronomy was seen as more of an empirical art than a rigorous science discipline. My contention now is that agronomy has indeed reinvented itself over the last 50 years. The traditional elements of observation and white pigs are as relevant today as they ever were. So I'm not saying we've replaced white pigs, but these approaches are much more likely now to be set in the context of farm systems rather than a particular piece of farm technology. And much more explicit attention is given to the longer-term sustainability and the riskiness of the whole operation. And models have demonstrated their value as an essential aid to agronomic interpretation and extrapolation. So I'm not saying ANOVAs still aren't done, but I'd say we're much more likely to see models as adjuncts to our experimental interpretation than just an analysis of variance. And I look forward to further advances in some of the amazing things that ICT is offering. Internet of Things, digital twins, advances in sensing, machine learning, model data fusion, and so on. So I look forward to seeing how these possibilities unfold in practice. Sorry. So, what challenges, I'm just about wrapped up, what challenges lie ahead? There's still issues about making sure the software infrastructure and the science software linkages are really healthy. We need to continue investing in the science that underpins the models. I really worry about the human capabilities and capacities in model development and use, and both require significant training and development. And appropriate engagement between, if you like, science agencies and commercial delivery pathways. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So, this is the last slide, in content terms anyway. So in preparing this talk, and more importantly the written paper, I couldn't help but be impressed by what I saw as the really positive energy exhibited by the keynote papers at the last agronomy conference. So Donald's 1965 plot was reworked by Pratley and Kierkegaard. And agronomy and breeding, no doubt, are key drivers to the progress since '65. The influence of the last 50 years of evolution in agronomic methods comes across very strongly in all the keynotes, virtually all the keynotes, particularly the role of systems analysis and modelling. So my contention is Australian agronomy is now bound by both white pegs and silicon chips, and that's a healthy thing. Hunt and Kierkegaard, who are both here today, call for, I think, transformational agronomy. I enjoyed that paper, but I came to the conclusion that what they were calling for is much in common with the story I've been going through today. This journey of farming systems research, meeting operations research, and embedded in a participative action research paradigm. So, in the paper I call this digitally enhanced systems agronomy, trying to place systems agronomy at the centre and the digital tools as the enhancement, complementary. I don't expect that name to stick. It's pretty clumpy, but hopefully you can get what I'm on about. Digital enhancement of systems agronomy. So I have a few thank yous, Peter. Thank you to the Australian Society of Agronomy and to the nominators who've got me up here today for the Donald Medal. I found 199 co-authors in the Web of Science. Shame I should keep going for one more paper. Who was it? It was Bradman, wasn't it? It went out at 99.96 or something. Is that the right number? Yeah. Look, I've got to thank CSIRO. 36 years. Lots of trials and tribulations, I'm sure those of you who are still with CSIRO or working with it, but in my view, still a national treasure. University of Queensland, where I started, and back, my APSIM colleagues, we had such a great time. ACR, I haven't really told you the full ACR story here, but another national treasure in my view. And of course, international colleagues. I want to dedicate this oration to Bob McCown. So Bob played a key part in my own agronomic journey, and I would contend not an insignificant part in the wider global journey over the last 50 years. So, thank you, Bob. Lots of great teams over the years. The Kenya team, APSRU in the early 90s, a lot of storming and forming going on there at that meeting. I think it was a team building meeting. My mates on our first trip to the USA, Peter Carberry and I were novice travellers to the US, and you can see what great dress sense we had in those days. In fact, I nearly shouldn't be here because Graham Hammer was driving a big American car on the wrong side of the road, and we nearly and stopping on the wrong side of the traffic lights. But it was our big US road trip through the Midwest. It was a great time. There's Richard Vanderlip in that photo. My mates from Kenya, the farmers from Kenya that we work with, and finally my wife and 2 children who've supported me in this whole journey. And in that photo, in 1986, getting on the train in Nairobi to head to Mombasa, and our two young kids. So thank you to them for this great support. So thanks, Peter. That's it.